it's a great honor to be here. Thank you to Philip and thank you to the Institute. And as Philip said, this is really a legacy project for the late, great Hilary Ballin, Deputy Vice Chancellor, who was not only a colleague, but also a wonderful friend. And I really miss her a lot. And so we'll, hopefully when this book is finally completed, it will be up to her standards. Anyway, well, I'd like to do a couple different things tonight. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of some of my projects and then segue into the pictures that I made in Abu Dhabi here in 2009 and 2010. And I think the city has much changed since then. And then after that, I'm going to reference a project called Cities of the Future. This was something I recently worked on for National Geographic that'll be published next month. And I'm going to use some of the outtakes from that project to show kind of what's happening in terms of cities around the world, good and bad examples of what the city of the future might be, and then put that in relationship to Abu Dhabi, and then end with a few pictures of the campus that I shot in 2014. So get a glass of water here too. And it's very bright in here. I'm sorry for, they need the lights to film me. Normally I'd love to have the pictures more in the dark so you can see them, but anyway, so I am the son of an architect. My mother edited books about art history. I started taking pictures when I was about 12, so this will mark my 50th year as a photographer. Those three things, photography, architecture, and history, really inform all of what I do. And I love looking at things over time, and I love looking at the layers of space, architecture, and the storytelling nature of that. So I would say that's a kind of general principle of what I do. I've lived in New York for almost 40 years, and in the early 80s, I was living downtown on South Street. That's right near the South Street Seaport, right across from the tall ships. And at that time, the Rouse Company out of Boston was considering developing the Seaport area, and they eventually built a big mall there. So I would go out at night and take pictures of this area. So this first picture shows the corner of Fulton and Front Street. You see a closed-up fishmongers. I mean, they open up very early in the morning, the restaurateurs and middlemen come and buy fish. And in the background, of course, the iconic Brooklyn Bridge, the great connector between Manhattan and Brooklyn, finished in 1883. And if you think about it, really built by hand. And then over to the left, just the first signs of this oncoming development, which ultimately took over the entire area and displaced the fish market to the Bronx. But one of the parts of New York that I've always loved is Times Square. Times Square in the 70s, 80s, 90s, walking across 42nd Street between 7th and 8th on a Saturday night was a huge adrenaline rush, if any of you ever experienced that. The movie Taxi Driver and many other films give a sense of the kind of the energy and the seediness and just the raw intensity of that block. This picture was made in 2002. This is Howard Johnson's on 46th Street and Broadway. This is the last little remnant of the old Times Square. But back in 1995, oops, sorry, went the wrong way. It looked like this. This is the Empire Theater, and you can see this theater that's been shut down and turned into kind of a storefront for fake IDs and various paraphernalia, sex toys, 8mm movies, and so forth. Now, this is 1995, and you have to imagine that a mere 7 years later, it became this, sort of the junk food of architecture. Architecture is just a machine with signs attached to it, a kind of soulless machine, if that. And so that, what some people call the Disneyfication, but really, it's just the nature of cities that what's decrepit and decayed will come back and have a new kind of chapter of life, but eventually this will decay and become another form of that previous existence. Now, theaters, speaking of theaters, in the late 90s, I got a clue that Havana, that it was possible for an American to travel to Cuba. I got a license from the Treasury Department, and I originally went there with the hopes of photographing old theaters, especially old movie theaters. And when I arrived, I realized it wasn't just the theaters, it was the whole city of Havana. It was such a paradox of waste and no waste, in the sense that nothing was wasted, and yet the entire city was, in a sense, wasted. People's lives had been wasted. This is the great Campo Amor, Teatro Campo Amor, which was a light opera house where Placido Domingo's father sang, and Ernest Hemingway read from this stage. And there had been a fire in the 60s, I believe, and the government just let the building slowly decay, just slowly fall apart. At the same time, it was being used as a garage for bicycle taxis and motorcycles. And there was even a guy living on the balcony on the second floor. You can kind of see his laundry up there. So in a way, everything was used, everything was occupied, but in that strange way. And then this picture, which is called Via Blanca, this is the road from Havana to the beaches of Veradero, about 2 hours away. This is Cuba's largest highway bridge. It was finished in 1960, right after Fidel's revolution. And what's interesting is, so you have this highway cutting through the jungle. For me, this has always been a kind of very image of the future. You know, what I saw at the World's Fair in 1965 in the GM Pavilion of the Futurama of this, you know, the progress going through the middle of the untamed nature. And yet here on this bridge, we see one lone car from the 1950s. And then the picture was made in 2012. So you have to ask yourself sort of exactly in what time does this picture exist? And this was ultimately used on the cover of the New York Times Magazine with the tagline, "Where is Cuba going?" So but when I was in Cuba, a lot of the people I met had studied in Russia. They'd gotten scholarships to go to Leningrad, and they said, "Oh, you must go to Russia. It's so amazing, everything's so big." And I was fortunate to get a magazine assignment that sent me to St. Petersburg. This would be in 2000. And yeah, things surely were big. This is what's called the General Staff Arch. It was designed by an Italian architect named Rastrelli. In the midground is what's called Alexander's Column. It's a sculpture of an angel with the face of the Tsar on it. And then in the rear is Catherine's Palace also, which houses the Hermitage Museum. And so this is very, very peaceful, very beautiful, very aesthetic setting, probably the most beautiful public space in Russia, but also one that has seen some of the greatest violence, the 1905 Bloody Sunday, and obviously the coup in 1917. Now, as a metaphor for Russia, I always like this picture. It's an icebreaker. It's been, this is in a shipyard, also in St. Petersburg. It's been freshly repainted in this orange-red color to kind of cut through the Arctic gloom. And it's a little hard to see on the slide, but there's a man standing at the bottom there with a little blue scarf who would have stood there for hours for me. And when I'm taking pictures of architecture, I'm usually very carefully leveling the frame, both backwards and sideways. And when I got the negative back of this picture, I noticed that the ship, you can see it's slightly heeling over. So you have this large, looming orange mass slightly heeling over. And for me, that was a very kind of image of Russia itself. And I also believe that in Russian, the root of the word for beautiful is also the word for red. So red is a very important, very vital color in the Russian culture. But having traveled a lot, I felt somewhat always displaced, that there was a kind of exoticism, that there was a kind of, that I was always somewhat at arm's length, even not just because of the language, but because I didn't really understand things down to a macro level. I wanted to be able to look at the ground and see a candy wrapper and be like, oh yeah, that's a Mars bar. I understand what that is. I understand a deeper narrative about the things I'm photographing. So in 2000, starting kind of in 2007, I made many trips started visiting Detroit. This is in the famous Rouge Plant out in Dearborn. This was where they made steel. It's the back end. This is an enormous complex. And in fact, at this time, in 2008, when I took this picture, the Ford Motor Company had sold off their steel-making operations to a Russian steel company. So this actually was owned by the Russians at the time that I was photographing it. Anyway, this is this vast, sort of melancholic space, a kind of, once the kind of the grandeur of the American empire, and completely empty. I mean, when I was there in June 2008, I mean, this plant, which sometimes had 100,000 workers, there were maybe 30 or 40 security guards. I mean, it was just a ghost town. And then this picture from 2009 called Henry's Office. This is was Henry Ford's executive suite when he was building the Model T in the late teens. And what you're seeing is the remnant of the old wool carpet that was literally in his office. And over time, that wool carpet has decayed into organic matter. Now, we're saying this building had been unoccupied since probably the 50s or 60s, so 50 years, and I was able to get into it through a whole sort of shenanigans. But that wool carpet decayed, turned into organic matter, and out of it grew carpet moss, or kind of moss. And so in the void left by man's absence, nature has returned, but in this very sort of toxic mode. I'm sorry. And anyway, that's, and the last point is that, so this, let me just go back for a second. So these pictures stirred a controversy in the States, in particular, called ruin porn. And myself and some other people who had been photographing these structures in Detroit were accused of a lack of empathy with workers who had worked in these factories, that we didn't provide enough context for the failures of capitalism, and that we should have been photographing the displaced people of Detroit. I kind of took exception to that. I felt that for me to photograph an auto worker sitting in their living room with a caption that said, Bill Smith worked in the factory for 50 years and he was laid off and he has no options to be retrained. That was a different model of photography. That the point of Detroit in 2008 and 2009 was its emptiness. That Detroit, that 2/3 of the population had left. That these factories were empty, and so the emptiness itself for me was the metaphor, not the fact that somebody had lost their job. I mean, that was important, but the metaphor at the time was the emptiness. And I felt that the whole ruin porn controversy itself was actually pretty superficial. And nobody really talks about ruin porn anymore anyway. But anyway, so kind of moving on from that theme about emptiness, my subsequent project was on the very center of the United States, along the 100th meridian. If you think of Texas and the east border of the Panhandle, that's exactly the 100th meridian, or Dodge City in Kansas. So the 100th meridian runs straight down through North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. It's right in the middle. And these were the lands that were last homesteaded in the United States because the very harsh conditions, very poor moisture, very difficult for agriculture without irrigation, extreme weather, a lot of issues. But people had come from all over the world. I mean, if you look at the works of Willa Cather, you get a sense of people, the pull that the prairie and the frontier exerted on people from around the world to come and to find a piece of land that they could call their own. And so it was very populated. And the peak population is probably right before World War I, and it slowly declines. So now we get to this place where this empty land is no longer beckoning us, but is become flyover country. It's to be avoided at all costs. So I was interested in that phenomenon. But there's also, and in this picture, which is called the Yellow Porch, you see not only, this is sort of late winter, and it's been a very dry winter, there's a lot of drought, so everything's this brown color. But you also see the Yellow Porch, and that's, the woman around the place who decided, I'm going to paint that porch yellow and try to add a little life to this place. So I always try to have an emotional counterpoint in my work, something that's, it may be gloomy, it may be melancholic, but there's also some other, maybe fragment of hope or sliver of dreams that somehow invested and manifest in the picture. So for instance, in this, which could be a very banal scene of a bunch of ranchers selling their cows, this sale barn has turned into kind of a mystical theater where these very stationary ranchers are watching what this herd of cattle turned into this kind of mystical whirl. And in fact, what happens is they'll bring in cows, and maybe a herd of 30 or 40 of them will spin around in this arena. And that created that kind of black mass. And there was one cow with a white spot on his head, and he was right in the middle. So he created the center of that whirlpool. And then, as Philip mentioned, my newest project, which is called Blue Alabama, which will be published in the fall. I've been working on that for the past 3 or 4 years, and it's really about the complex emotional landscape of the South, the mixture of fear, cruelty, beauty, spirituality that the South embodies, and especially in Lower Alabama, which is probably the most forgotten about, neglected part of the South, but also the place where the civil rights movement really was spawned in the Pettus Bridge, the March to Selma, the March to Montgomery. So it's historically such a vital place, and yet kind of forgotten about. So the book deals with various narrative strains of that part of the South. This is a Jewish social club in Selma, a potential meeting place, potential place of reconciliation. Not that it can or will happen, but it's the possibility. And this, an all-black house, actually it's covered in heart pine boards that have never been stained or painted, and so those pine boards, these are ancient pine trees. These are 400 or 500-year-old pine trees that were cut down in the 1850s and made into these boards, age over time to this beautiful tobacco black color. And this black house is photographed by moonlight. But this is sort of standing in contrast to the kind of typical white-columned antebellum mansion that one imagines in the Old South. And then there's Abu Dhabi. So I had worked with Hilary Ballin on this book about Robert Moses, and then she was stolen away by NYU, and she had told me about this project, and she said, we need to show what Abu Dhabi looks like. Nobody knows what Abu Dhabi looks like. Let's come over, photograph it, so we can give the students a sense of what this place looks like. And sure enough, this is actually a guy living out in the desert, and he's a falcon keeper, and great. I love that. But Abu Dhabi is really about this. It's about tearing things down and building things up at the same time. And for me, what was most challenging was, having seen what I do and what I'm interested in, if things started in 1971 and I'm there in 2009, that's, 38? Anyway, it's not a long period of time, and all those layers of history are so compressed. It was really a challenge for me to deal with a place that literally, for me, had very little history, very little depths of history, very few layers. So I had to come up with a lot of visual strategies about how to kind of pull those layers apart and how to tell the story of the city. So one way was to, obviously show the contrast between the bottom and the top. The different classes of things, different classes of people, different styles of building. Something old and new. And again, this was one strategy, but this is a kind of very simple strategy for me. It's a sort of like one thing against something else. As time went on, I began to, again, I was here in 2009, 2010 for a couple trips, looking at the density of this and trying to, again, find deeper layers. So here's a small mosque downtown, and I love the guy who's at the bottom down there, kind of sweeping the doorway. So trying to build up this sort of vertical landscape in Abu Dhabi. And of course, there were open spaces, places of leisure, places of luxury in a sense, and also kind of very rundown apartment buildings for the workers. And then the founder's image in places like a mall. So again, trying to begin to look at very sort of layering, but in a different way, because I didn't have sort of the usual modes of history to kind of fall back on. So what I ended up really loving was these small concrete buildings, probably built in the 80s or 90s, that were being torn down as I was photographing them, but had a kind of charm in the context of Abu Dhabi. And I loved them, even though they're perhaps not masterpieces of architecture, but in their kind of idiosyncratic way, they really stood out for me in the landscape of Abu Dhabi. And I felt that they were probably the most threatened part of the city. And so I love the little retail level, and then the residential. I love buildings that combine in a kind of intimate scale the residential and commercial aspects. Or in this case, where modernism with a nod to the history of Islamic architecture, and standing very boldly in contrast in its unfinished concrete compared to all the glass towers around it. I believe this building is called the Honeycomb Building. And so this kind of odd futurism, this sort of 80s futuristic style of building, again, this was one of my initial focuses, photographing the city. And I have to emphasize, this book and this whole project is kind of a work in progress. I may go back to these various spots and see what's happened, to see how this building has either been torn down or changed or renovated. It'd be very interesting to see that, because I do feel in Abu Dhabi that not only are the layers of history collapsed, but even time itself has collapsed in a way. Sort of charming street life and the kind of vibrant street life that was here for me. And again, with the image of the founder. One of my favorite buildings is the taxi stand. And in this view, you can see how the stepped roofs mimic the steps of the stadium in the distance there. And then underneath, it has this sort of tent-like structure, which I love. And I think this is the bus station. It's great pillars here. And the command station outside was great. Again, this kind of almost Brazilian style futurism. It's like people are building, like, this is going to be a new city, and this is what a new city looks like. This is the future. And of course, one of my favorite places, the airport, the old airport terminal, which looks like the inside of a genie's bottle. And even the mosque at the Officers Club has a little bit of that sense of kind of this futuristic style to it. And this picture, this is actually a private home. And this was my homage to an American photographer who was actually a friend of mine and also an inspiration named Julius Schulman, who photographed a lot of 50s and 60s modernist architecture out in Los Angeles. This idyllic oasis of home. But as I mentioned, I mean, things were being torn down very much as much as I was trying to get to them, they were also being torn down. And one of the things that's interesting in Abu Dhabi is that the lifespan of a building seems to be very short here. I mean, most buildings, I mean, they're built for a lifespan of maybe 100 years, sometimes more, sometimes less. The old colonial buildings in Havana, stone, they've been around 400 or 500 years. But it seems as though in Abu Dhabi, the lifespan of a building might be only 15 years, which is really kind of crazy, but that's how it's done here. Whereas the new construction, I mean, this is the Fountain of the Emirates Hotel, and then beyond you see the construction, the cranes are actually moving. I mean, it's all night long. It's 24 hours a day, the cycle of building something new. So I suppose if the construction cycle is that fast, if new buildings can go up that quickly, then maybe that justifies to some degree taking down buildings so quickly. I was also fascinated by this contrast between the openness, these sort of sand, desert-like, the islands, and then all of a sudden a huge glass tower just arising out of nothing. I mean, there's no streets, there's no roads, there's no shops. It's just, all of a sudden we have a huge skyscraper in the middle of nowhere. This is the Norman Foster building, I think, in Khalifa. What is it? Okay. Is it not by Norman Foster? Okay, sorry. But people compare it to an up sideways coin, right? Isn't that right? And here, this is when the mosque was being finished, the Sheikh Zayed Mosque. And I love the contrast between the magnificence of the domes and then the floor polishers out front, finishing off the terrazzo floors. And the contrast between this amazing, vast, capacious interior and then this very modest, almost homemade mosque. The call to prayer in an alleyway. Or overflowing the streets on a Friday. And a detail of that. And then I was also fascinated by these small bits of green, which will come up later in about cities of the future, about these little green spaces. This was a little outdoor movie theater tucked in between these two buildings. And I love these sort of almost like a little pocket park, impromptu pocket park, contrasted against the future, what's coming. And in the low rise with the trees and that bit of greenery, how important that is to a city. And again, here the contrast between the low-rise residential neighborhoods with the greenery and the wall of mirrored glass around it. And how green spaces are so necessary in a city. That bit of openness, that bit of light coming through. So I enjoyed the vibrancy of the markets here in Abu Dhabi, as well as the car repair shops. And then also photographed out in the sort of new suburbs of Khalifa. With their sort of 50s-style American fantasy, as well as the McMansions, Abu Dhabi style. And these sort of walled compounds, again, keeping out, sort of not in dialogue really with what's around them, just as sort of little islands, again, in the desert. So keep this in mind. So then let's look at kind of the origin of what new cities are. So this is Letchworth in England. This was built in 1903. This is the first planned city in the world. It's a garden city. It was supposed to be where the town and the country would meet in these cities. And so there were sort of serpentine roads to kind of give a kind of organic feel to the cities. They also had walkable green spaces. This is Welwyn Garden City, which is built about 15 years later. And again, you have a walkable green axis that runs right through the heart of the city. And these are still very viable principles. I mean, these cities are very much beloved in England. And for a reason, in that they combine the town and the country in such a meaningful, significant way and allow for a certain quality of life. Now, other places like here, this is Rotterdam. This is a new market hall in Rotterdam. And here they've combined, when I talked about residential and commercial before, here's a kind of very innovative example of that. So you have this large sort of tubular building, and the fat part of the tube, that's all apartments. So that's all residences. And then the inside of the tube is a big market hall with all kinds of shops and restaurants. And so in an urban setting, you have those two integrated in a very interesting, very innovative way. And then on the inside, you even have a huge mural of fruits and flowers and kind of nod to that country city meeting point. Now, also, this is a suburb outside of Amsterdam. This is called Oysterveld, and very unusual for the Dutch people. This is a place where people are allowed to build whatever home they want. They're given the land, and the condition is that not only do they have to build their own home, but they also have to work with their neighbors to build the sewers and the electrical stations and develop the grid and build schools. I mean, everything comes from the bottom up here, which is, to a certain segment of the Dutch society, very appealing. That kind of freedom, that kind of sense of organizing, not from the top down, not being told, like, okay, here's how you do it, but being able to shape it from the bottom up. So in some cases, this is actually a global village being built by a very forward-thinking couple that's going to be home that will house refugees. And so you see this sort of swirling, kind of wheel-like shape that kind of will be the center of the village. And you see the brick masonry buildings coming along, replacing the kind of temporary yurts. But this idea of a kind of organically evolved village is very, very interesting. And then in some cases, you have friends who got together and actually built like a little neighborhood all on their own. And here you can see a lot of solar panels. It's obviously very high-tech, very green. But again, all working together to build a community. Now, in terms of cities of the future and transportation, that's obviously going to be one of the biggest needs. Right now, about 50% of the world's population lives in cities. By 2050, about 2/3 of the world will live in cities. And so as cities become denser and denser, how to get people to move around, how to move people around efficiently becomes one of the most important concerns for a city. So this is La Paz, Bolivia. This is the world's highest capital city. It's at 12,000 feet. It's in a bowl, and then there's a plateau around it, and there's another city called El Alto. That's kind of the main city of the Aymara indigenous people. Anyway, La Paz had this problem that there was really no real efficient way to get people from point A to point B. There were buses, but very windy streets, or taxis, so the streets were super crowded. So La Paz has become, starting in 2014, they hired a German-Austrian company, and they put in a series of these aerial cable cars. They're the world's only city in the world whose public transportation is based on the cable car system. And they have about 9 lines now, and they're adding 3 or 4 more in the next year or two. And it has really changed the way people go to school, the way they commute, the way they, the whole dynamic quality of La Paz has been utterly transformed by this, innovative transportation system. And it also provides amazing views of the city itself, so it's kind of fascinating to ride. And it also hasn't really interfered with the existing structure of the street, so they didn't have to tear out, cemeteries or other, homes that were in the way. I mean, it went kind of right on top of that. So that sort of spatial layering of the city is very interesting. And as a sidebar, this is El Alto. So this is the Aymara part. This is the flat plains up above La Paz. There's an architect named Freddy Mamami, who's Aymara, and he started building cholets. These are homes for the kind of new wealthy Aymara people, and using not Palladio, but using the textiles and the kind of native designs of the Aymara people as a foundation for his architectural practice. So this incredibly painted building, or this, which has a commercial level at the bottom. The kind of mid-level is an event space, like a big banquet hall, because Aymara people have lots of celebrations and weddings and festivities, and they like to kind of gather together. And then the residence is on the top there. And this is just kind of amazing works of art. And then there's been a sort of spin-off where people even use ideas from Transformers to build their garage doors. So this revolution in transportation has also spawned other creative pathways, let's say, in this country. Now, probably the most successful futuristic city in the world is Singapore on many levels. This is the Marina Sands Casino and the Gardens by the Bay and Supertree Grove. I think Singapore works on many levels. It has this expressive architecture that relates to its kind of dynamic culture. It has it's not only are there green walkable pathways throughout the city, but in fact the buildings themselves are green. They're covered in plants in some cases with thin aluminum skins. Now, I mean, given that Singapore is close to the equator, it is a tropical climate, and things like this are possible, but I mean, they exploit those possibilities to the fullest. Here's another example of this, kind of how the country, the idea of the country has literally invaded the architecture. But they've also set aside certain districts of the city. This is the Muslim quarter of Singapore. So not only does this set aside, it not only creates architectural diversity, but also obviously cultural diversity. And this difference of scale really adds, and these are protected areas by the government that add to the quality of life in Singapore overall. Not to mention that this is called the Auto Rider. This is the world's first mass transit vehicle. And this is something that's obviously coming, they're experimenting with, but to have not only electric cars and driverless cars, but even mass transit, have driverless mass transit. Shanghai, it calls itself Little New York, but in fact, New York has 8.5, 9 million people. Shanghai is 26 million. It's 3 times the size of New York. Obviously, transportation is a huge issue here. And so Shanghai has been very aggressive about building highways, but also having multi-layered tiers when you can see there's a walkway, that red walkway, that's for pedestrians versus all the overpasses for cars. But what's interesting is they've taken this bit of infrastructure and through LED lighting, turned it into a kind of sculptural aesthetic experience as well. So again, reinventing the landscape of the city. But it does have a very authoritarian culture, too. I mean, these are shaming boards. So there are cameras set up at certain intersections, and if you jaywalk, they project your image. You can see kind of on the screen, like the red bars. So the woman in the white shirt there, she's just jaywalked, and so they've kind of filmed her. And I guess they'll get to the point where they'll actually flash your name and your ID number and stuff. I mean, it's not popular, obviously, and people in Shanghai are like, oh, but in a lot of smaller cities, there's many of these things. Lastly, we come to Baku, Azerbaijan. Baku is very famous. I mean, obviously another very oil-wealthy country, but famous for this kind of trophy architecture, which I found beautiful, but almost out of context, sort of rising out of nowhere in a sense. These are the famous flame towers. My understanding is one is hotel, one is residential, and one is empty. They light up at night. They have flames. There's soccer players. I mean, they're spectacular objects. But I don't know really how integrated they are in terms of the overall urban fabric of Baku. I mean, there are some masterpieces there. This is Zaha Hadid's Haida Cultural Center, which is just an extraordinary building. So along the way, you get some real winners, but overall, I'm not certain about how trophy architecture really enhances the lives of the everyday citizen of a city. So now we're back to Saadiyat Island. I was here in 2014 when the campus was just finished. And so I had a lot of freedom to photograph the campus, but unfortunately there were very few people. So I'm back this time to photograph the campus, hopefully with more students and more life in the buildings. But if we think about what we just saw in terms of cities and cities of the future, it's interesting to look at the campus as a place where the green is embraced, where there's multi-layers to it. So you have the High Line, this walkable space that connects the city of the campus. And I know this was one of the architect's main preoccupations, was this kind of this road connecting. So I think that that's a very, very successful part of the campus itself. And these shaded walkways through. And the different, again, like in Letchworth with that turning road, these curving roads that create different perspectives as you walk on them. And as well as a kind of main walking street. And then also, there's subsequent layers. You have this underground layer, too, which I really, I'm fascinated by. And so there's a sub-layer to the entire university. So as a city, it's very functional. It operates on a lot of principles of intelligent design. The real question will be, what gets built up around it and how ultimately the campus is contextualized within the rest of Abu Dhabi. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.